It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening. Owen and Jack, two lifelong friends, had spent the day hiking in the countryside, far away from the bustle of the city. They had taken this trail countless times before, but something about this particular day felt off. The sky had taken on an unusual red hue as the sun set, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. As they made their way down the rocky path toward an old abandoned ruin, Jack, always the more cautious of the two, hesitated. "Owen, maybe we should head back. Something doesn't feel right." Owen, bolder and more adventurous, laughed it off. "Come on, Jack, it's just a sunset. Don't let a little creepy lighting scare you." They continued on, their banner echoing to the empty ruin, but as they ventured deeper into the stone structure, they stumbled upon something they had not expected. A man, heavily injured and leaning against the cold stone walls. His clothes were tattered, his face pale, and a deep gash ran down his side, bleeding heavily. "Help me," the man croaked, his voice barely audible. Owen rushed to his side, kneeling next to the stranger, while Jack stood back, his fear rising. "Who did this to you?" Owen asked, his voice filled with concern. The man looked up at them, his eyes filled with a haunting seriousness. "A sorcerer, a dark sorcerer. He seeks to raise the dead on the night of the blood moon, tomorrow night, when the moon turns red and the rift between the living and the dead will open." Jack's blood ran cold. "The blood moon?" The man nodded, struggling to speak. "It's a prophecy, ancient, powerful. The sorcerer plans to unleash the dead upon the world. The only way to stop him is to pierce his heart with his sword." He weakly gestured to a sword lying beside him, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. Owen picked up the sword, its weight heavy in his hand. "Where do we find the sorcerer?" The man coughed, his breath rattling. "The place. You must find the old graveyard. The ritual will be performed there. The dead, they're already bleeding into this world." He gasped for breath, his strength fading fast. "You must stop him, or the world is doomed." And with that, the man collapsed, lifeless. Owen stood, sword in hand, his jaw set with determination. "We have to stop this." Jack's hand shook. "Owen, are you sure about this? We don't even know where to go." "We'll figure it out," Owen said, his voice unwavering. "But I can't do this alone." Jack hesitated, fear gnawing at him, but he couldn't leave his friend to face this alone. "I'll come with you. I'm not brave, but I won't let you do this by yourself." They shared a glance, knowing this journey would be unlike anything they had ever faced before, but they had no choice. The fate of the world rested on their shoulders, and time was running out. Night had fallen, and the weight of the prophecy hung heavy in the air. Owen and Jack gathered what little supplies they had and prepared to set out on their journey. As they were about to leave the ruins, a low growl echoed through the dark. Owen froze, his grip tightening on the sword. Jack's heart raced as he scanned the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Out of the darkness, a figure shambled toward them. Its skin was gray and decaying, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. It was a corpse, risen from the dead. The stench of rot filled the air as it staggered closer, its movements slow but menacing. "Zombies," Owen whispered, his voice filled with dread. "The rift, it's already opening." Jack stumbled backward, his fear paralyzing him. "Owen, we're not ready for this." Owen swung the sword, his first blow clumsily, but enough to knock the creature back. It hissed, its rotting flesh tearing as it fell to the ground, but it wasn't defeated. It slowly began to rise again. "We have to kill it for good," Owen shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Jack fumbled with a nearby rock, throwing it at the creature's head. It distracted the zombie long enough for Owen to land a second, more powerful blow. The sword pierced the creature's skull, and with a final shrug, it collapsed into a heap of lifeless flesh. Breathing heavily, Owen wiped the sweat from his brow. "That was close." Jack stared at the body, his face pale. "I'm not sure I can do this, Owen. I can't fight." "You don't have to," Owen said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "I'll do the fighting. You just stay by my side. We'll figure this out together." Jack nodded, though the fear hadn't left his eyes. "Alright, let's go." They set off into the night, the knowledge that the dead were rising and the world's doom was fast approaching, pushing them forward. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, and things were about to get much, much worse. As dawn broke, Owen and Jack arrived at a small, deserted town that had long since fallen into ruin. The buildings were crumbling, overtaken by nature. It was here, in the remains of an old library, that Jack's knowledge as a scholar became invaluable. "We need to find where this graveyard is," Owen said, pacing back and forth. The man said it's hidden, but he didn't give us any real clues. Jack had been rifting through dusty old books, his fingers stained with the decay of forgotten knowledge. "There's an old legend about a graveyard that exists in the middle of the realms," he said slowly. flipping through a tattered book. It's said to be where the barrier between the living and the dead is thinnest. That must be where the sorcerer plans to perform this ritual. Owen peered over Jack's shoulder. Is there anything in there about how to find it? Jack frowned, scanning the page. It says the graveyard lies within the heart of the valley, marked by the oldest tree in the land. It's cryptic, but I think I know where that is. Owen's face lit up with renewed determination. Then we gotta leave. Before they could leave, however, the sound of rustling paper and books falling echoed through the empty library. Both of them turned to see more zombies stumbling out from the shadows, drawn to the presence of the living. Not again, Jack muttered, backing away as the undead closed in. Owen readied his sword. Stay close, Jack. We'll fight our way out of this. The battle in the library was fierce. Owen's swordsmanship, though unrefined, was improving with each strike. He swung with purpose, hacking away at the zombies as they swarmed. But for every one that fell, another seemed to rise from the dust. Jack fought on in his own way, using his intelligence to knock over shelves and barricade the creatures as they tried to reach him. Together they managed to escape the library and flee into the streets. Panting, Jack leaned against the wall. I don't know how much I can take of this. Owen gripped the sword, his eyes hard. We don't have a choice. The blood moon rises tomorrow night. We have to find that graveyard and stop the sorcerer before it's too late. Jack nodded, the weight of their mission sinking in. They didn't have much time. After hours of travel, Owen and Jack finally reached the valley where the legendary graveyard was said to be hidden. The landscape was desolate, filled with jagged rocks and twisted trees, and at the center of it all stood the oldest tree they had ever seen. Its bark gnarled and blackened with age, its roots stretching across the ground like a vast web. This is it, Jack whispered, awe and dread in his voice. The place where the sorcerer will raise the dead. Owen nodded grimly. We have to stop him before the blood moon reaches its peak. As they ventured deeper into the graveyard, the air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Gravestones jutted out from the earth like crooked teeth, and faint whispers could be heard, as though the spirits of the dead were watching them. This place feels wrong, Jack muttered, his eyes darting around. Keep it together, Owen urged. We've got a job to do. Suddenly the ground shook violently, and the air was filled with an unearthly roar. From the shadows the sorcerer appeared, his robes tattered and dark, his eyes glowing with malevolent power. You're too late, the sorcerer hissed, his voice echoing across the graveyard. The blood moon is almost upon us. The dead will rise, and the world will fall. Owen stepped forward, brandishing the sword. Not if I have anything to say about it. The sorcerer laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down their spines. You don't think you can stop me, boy. You don't even understand what you're up against. The battle began, fierce and brutal. The sorcerer summoned the dead from their graves, their decaying forms rising from the earth to join the fight. Owen swung the sword, cutting down the zombies as they charged, but it was clear that the sorcerer's power was growing stronger with each passing moment. Jack, though terrified, stood by his friend's side, using his wits to dodge the attacks and search for an opening. But as the blood moon climbed higher into the sky, the ground beneath them began to split, revealing a dark rift, the very portal to the underworld. We're running out of time, Jack shouted, his voice filled with panic. Owen gritted his teeth. We have to finish this now. The sorcerer raised his arms to the sky, chanting in a language long forgotten by the living. The blood moon glowed brighter, its crimson light casting an ominous shadow over the battlefield. The dead continued to rise from the graves, clawing their way toward Owen and Jack. Owen fought valiantly, his sword a blur of silver as he cut through the undead horde. But for every zombie that fell, two more seemed to take its place. The sorcerer's magic was too powerful, too overwhelming. Jack, despite his fear, tried to help wherever he could, throwing rocks and using anything he could find off the relentless assault. We can't keep this up, Jack shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Owen's eyes burned with determination. We have to. The world depends on it. But even Owen, with all his bravery and resolve, could see the tide of battle turning against him. The rift was growing wider, and the dead were pouring out faster than they could fight. The blood moon was reaching its zenith, and the sorcerer's power was at its peak. We're too late, Jack muttered, his voice trembling with fear. No, Owen shouted, his voice hoarse. We can still stop him. But as Owen rushed toward the sorcerer, sword raised high, a wave of dark magic struck him, sending him crashing to the ground. The sorcerer stood over him, a triumphant sneer on his face. You failed, boy, the sorcerer hissed. The dead will rise, and your world will burn. Owen struggled to stand, but his strength was fading. The sword felt heavy in his hand, and the weight of defeat pressed down on him like a crushing force. It was then that Jack, his face pale but filled with grim determination, stepped forward. There's another way, Jack said, quietly, his voice shaking. I didn't want it to come to this, but Owen's heart sank as he realized what Jack meant. No, Jack, you can't. Jack nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. I have to. It's the only way. Jack took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he reached for the sword. Owen tried to stop him, but his body was weak, his strength drained from the relentless battle. He could only watch in horror as Jack gripped the sword tightly and stepped toward the sorcerer. The sorcerer laughed, his eyes glowing with dark magic. What do you think you can do, boy? You are nothing. Jack's face was pale, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. I can end this. Before the sorcerer could react, Jack plunged the sword into his chest with all his strength. The sorcerer let out a scream, his body convulsing as the magic of the sword ripped through him. But Jack didn't stop there. With a final desperate push, Jack forced the sorcerer toward the rift. The dark magic swirled around them both as a portal to the underworld opened wide. The sorcerer clawed at the ground, trying to escape, but Jack held on, his grip unrelenting. Owen screamed, his voice filled with anguish. Jack, no! Don't do this! But Jack only gave him a sad smile, his eyes filled with acceptance. I'm sorry, Owen. This is the only way. And with that, Jack and the sorcerer disappeared into the rift, the portal closing behind them with a deafening roar. The world went silent. Owen collapsed to his knees, his heart shattered. The blood moon, once a symbol of doom, began to fade from the sky, its crimson light slowly dimming as the rift between the living and the dead was sealed. The dead that had risen from the graves collapsed once more, their bodies crumbling into dust as the magic that had animated them dissipated into the air. But Owen didn't care. His best friend, his brother in all but blood, was gone. Jack had sacrificed himself to save the world that no one would ever know. The town, the people, the world, they will never understand the cost of their survival. Owen had saved the world from destruction, but in doing so he had lost a person who had always stood by his side. As dawn broke over the horizon, Owen stood, his body heavy with exhaustion and grief. The sword, now dull and lifeless, lay on the ground where Jack had left it. Owen picked it up, feeling the weight of his friend's sacrifice in his hands. He walked away from the graveyard, his heart heavy, knowing that while the world had been saved, it had come at a terrible price. And as the sun rose, Owen whispered to the wind, no one would ever know, but I will never forget. The prophecy had been fulfilled, the rift had been sealed, the dead would rest once more. But Owen knew that the true cost of victory was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life.